It's been 8 years since Mickey Mouse and his cronies obtained Lucasfilm in a brutal takeover, and it appears most Star Wars fans despise everything Disney have done. With Star Wars, for me, it seems the rule is now to hate on anything that Disney produces, except for a few exceptions. However, hardcore fans of Star Wars have put Star Wars on this incredible pedestal.
You are putting the pussy up on this pedestal. You're just building the pussy up, man.
To which Star Wars never did anything wrong and was always of the highest quality. And George Lucas created a 6-film trilogy which was sheer perfection, comparable to, say, the Godfather films. Since Disney acquired Lucasfilm and Star Wars films, 5 have been made. The films have received a mixed response, from critical acclaim to critical panning. We also saw the very first Star Wars box office bomb with Solo: A Star Wars Story. A Star Wars film performing badly at the box office was something many commentators didn't think was possible. 3 Star Wars games have been released to a fairly good response. The TV shows have been critically lauded, with Rebels having a more mixed reception, and the comics have been generally praised. Despite everything, Disney have produced Star Wars media that is pretty good in quality. Many fans don't like Star Wars' new Mickey Mouse overlord, and in this video I'm going to be looking at whether Disney have destroyed Star Wars. But before I get into that, please do subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the content, please do like the video, and please do check out my podcast called What's the Topic. There'll be a link in the description. Thank you. I think most fans lay their hatred mostly at these 2 films. The Last Jedi was a critical darling, but however fans were very on the fence when it came to their critique of this film, with the general consensus basically being you can either love or hate this film. There's just no in between, similarly to films like Man of Steel and Batman vs Superman. Rise of Skywalker, however, was universally lambasted by fans and became the worst critically received Star Wars film, coming in even lower than Phantom Menace. At this point, fans began to say Disney had ruined Star Wars and destroyed the legacy George Lucas had left when he sold the rights to Disney. Further fuel was added to the fire by Lucas when he compared Disney to slave traders, and seemed to basically not agree much with the direction the sequel trilogy had gone. I understand why a lot of hate is directed towards episode 8 and 9, with 8 being particularly divisive, simply because there are such a number of ideas in this film that work and don't work when compared to basically everything in Rise of Skywalker not working. For me, I've always felt the sequel trilogy on the whole was pretty good. There are certainly many aspects that do not work. The films were obviously not meticulously planned out, and Rise of Skywalker was a complete knee-jerk reaction to The Last Jedi and abandoned Colin Trevorrow's ideas to continue the story set up from Last Jedi. Whether his film would have been good or not is a completely different discussion. Overall, the films were fun space adventures with charismatic characters, great cinematography, and most importantly, looked like the original trilogy Star Wars, compared to, well, the prequels. I think a major aspect people don't realise when they call out Disney for ruining Star Wars is out of the 9 saga films, only 2 of them were actually superb films. The rest of them have obvious flaws and redeeming qualities. However, these 2 films are the only films I consider to be simply fantastic films, which a vast majority of people would agree on, as there are so few flaws in these films. Some would even consider these 2 films to be some of the greatest cinema ever produced. To say that Star Wars is broken and destroyed simply because of these 2 films is pretty ridiculous. At the time of Lucasfilm's purchase, the Star Wars franchise wasn't doing fantastically. After the release of the prequels, many people felt Star Wars had lost some of its identity of practical effects, with the glossy, over-polished prequels souring that legacy. Combine that with the re-release of the original trilogy and everything George Lucas had added, people thought Star Wars was going in a dangerous direction. If you don't like the new Star Wars films, that's fine. But to say Disney are a heartless corporation that have sucked the life out of Star Wars in order to make some money, well, it's just wrong. George Lucas did the exact same thing with this franchise, and what I would say is actually the franchise is less focused on merchandise, but that could be because I'm too old to notice the toy commercials compared to when the prequels came out. The thing is, I would say quality-wise, these films are pretty good. They're not as good as the original trilogy, but they're slightly better than the prequels. So to say that these films are complete heresy is just ridiculous. It's simply because the prequels had fans and people liked the look of those films, and those were new fans, so they don't like these new films because they don't recognise them from the prequels they used to watch. It's no secret that Force Awakens, released back in 2015, box office returns of the new Star Wars films on a somewhat downward spiral. Force Awakens grossing close to $3 billion, future films were never going to match that. After the hype surrounding the films had died down, Rise of Skywalker managed to gross just over $1 billion. Many have said that these dwindling box office returns point to the fact that people are not interested in Star Wars as much as they used to be. And whilst I do agree interest in Star Wars has dwindled, I don't think it has disappeared. It isn't good that the final film in this new trilogy is the worst critically received film in the series, and it doesn't paint a good picture that it is also the lowest grossing in this new trilogy. And the film that preceded Rise of Skywalker, Solo: A Star Wars Story, is the worst grossing film out of all 11 live action Star Wars films. It's a worrying trend. I would take this though with a pinch of salt, when you consider Solo was a film fans and audiences were never asking for, so had no existing interest for, compared to the other spin-off film, Rogue One, where an actual story people had interest was told. And when we say Rise of Skywalker only grossed $1 billion, well, if you compare that to Attack of the Clones, which grossed $650 million in 2002, adjust that for inflation, and the film is just below the $1 billion mark. So whilst yes, the films are seeing a lower box office return, which shows a worrying trend, the films are still doing well. Although I would add Rise of Skywalker had a substantially higher budget than Attack of the Clones, so did need to do better. But Rise of Skywalker was still profitable, just not on the same level Attack of the Clones was, or any of the prequels were. I think the major problem is, this new trilogy, Disney have pumped in a lot more money than there was pumped in to the prequel trilogy, so it does need to do substantially better. And I think that is the main point to look at though, is profitability of these new films. With much higher production budgets compared to their predecessors, there is less room for failure. And these films, I would estimate, all need to hit the $1 billion worldwide gross in order to be considered profitable. However, all these films, despite Solo, have managed that. However, the downward trend would be a slight concern, but I don't think it means Disney are ruining Star Wars and no one wants to see these films. I just believe Star Wars doesn't resonate with people like it did 20 years ago. A big part of Star Wars is the merchandising, mainly the toys, and the marketing potential this series has, having such a broad appeal, the possibilities in merchandising rights is pretty endless. George Lucas identified this early on in Star Wars' life, and began the process of creating toys and expanding the merchandise of Star Wars out to other mediums, such as comics and video games. A big point people say why Disney are destroying Star Wars is due to the decreasing toy sales, which point directly to children not being interested in the new Star Wars characters, as these films do not have as big a fan base as the previous trilogies. And whilst it is kind of true that kids are not interested in Star Wars as previous generations, I don't think this can directly correlate to being Disney's fault for not creating charismatic characters which connect with children. I think characters like Rey and Finn, a woman and black man, have done loads to connect with children who have had very little representation in Star Wars. I think there are many aspects which is the reasoning behind the declining toy sales of Star Wars, mainly two problems. Number one, Star Wars is competing with more competition compared to the original trilogy and prequel trilogy. Now they're a huge franchise which have copied Star Wars merchandising tactics, mainly Marvel Studios, a franchise which has become more successful than Star Wars. It's very hard to compete. And number two, toy sales are down in general. Kids don't play with toys anymore, they are far more interested in iPads and computer games, which have replaced toys. Toys are now seen more as collectibles, and this is a niche market of people who will buy these products. With the art of collectibles working on nostalgia, with little nostalgia with the sequel trilogy due to it being just released, sales won't be great. I don't think the sequel trilogy or the spin-off films has obtained as many fans as Disney would have liked. But to say because Star Wars hasn't maintained the incredible run it was on, doesn't mean these characters or films are terrible and have no worth. The video games have sold well, with even Battlefront 2 doing well despite its controversial release, and has managed to maintain a solid fan base, and is still a relevant game 3 years on from its release. The new films haven't resonated with fans or audience members like the previous films, but this doesn't point to Disney having tarnished or ruined Star Wars. There are many other factors, and I think how people try to find anything to point at and blame Disney for with Star Wars is unfounded information most of the time. I am a huge Star Wars fan. It is my favourite franchise of films, and I can enjoy all 11 films. I prefer some to others, but I never actively try to hate any Star Wars media released, and judge it on my preferences for what I like. What does annoy me though is the constant hate train directed towards the new Star Wars films. Whilst Disney have made some bad calls, especially with the previous two films, Disney have created some of the best Star Wars media released in the last 30 years, such as Force Awakens, countless comics, and The Mandalorian. Rise of Skywalker was a bad film, but I think for fans to now shout over Twitter that Disney have destroyed the legacy of Star Wars is simply ridiculous. George Lucas' prequel films were bad films, with Revenge of the Sith being a complete reaction to how his two previous films were received. Now fans laud these films as incredible, despite Hayden Christensen's semi-retiring from acting and how he was treated by fans. And let's not forget Jake Lloyd, who has had numerous problems due to how fans treated him after the release of Phantom Menace. The Star Wars franchise under Disney's leadership has been a success. The films have been of good quality with great characters and a pleasing aesthetic. I think Disney have made some bad choices, such as releasing films each year and 2 years between saga films, attempting an MCU release style to which Star Wars doesn't really work like that. They are more event films compared to cinematic universe films. Also, not having a clear, concise plan for their trilogy hurt Disney's reputation with making Star Wars films. Now the trilogy is clunky and has no flowing narrative. Thirdly, it doesn't help the constant director change, with Rogue One, Solo and Rise of Skywalker having director changes, leaving the films feeling very corporately made and without much personality compared to Force Awakens and Last Jedi, which at least have a style you can identify with. Overall, I like the Disney Star Wars media, and I think it's an improvement on what has preceded it. Obviously it's not as good as the originals, but how would you ever recreate that? It's just impossible. As always, thank you for watching.